I want to talk about radioactive radiation this morning, in particularly where it fits in the electromagnetic spectrum and its relevance to you as building biologists. Now, when we think of radioactive radiation, we tend to think of Chernobyl or Hiroshima, nuclear bombs, all this sort of thing. How on earth could it relate to a home? Well, you're going to be quite surprised by the time I look at the sources within the home as to the fact that we're all exposed to radioactivity on a daily basis because we live on the Earth. And the Earth naturally contains radioactive minerals, such as, can anyone think of any?
Uranium.
Radon, which comes from uranium.
Mercury.
Mercury is a heavy metal, not so much a radioactive material. But uranium is a good example.
What about granite?
Granite, because it contains uranium deposits. So granite is a rock that's more likely to be radioactive because it contains uranium deposits within it. Uranium, thorium, potassium are the most common forms of radioactive rocks naturally within the ground, or materials radioactive in the ground. As a result of this, we're all exposed to a background radiation as a result of the uranium deposits within the Earth, and therefore we have a certain amount that is acceptable within our society no matter where we live. Some countries have much higher rates of radioactivity than other countries, and this means that they are more exposed to certain levels. Because there's a background radiation level that's acceptable, it's almost like part of living on the Earth that we're exposed to this, and it doesn't seem to have any negative effects. It's when this radioactivity level increases to a certain point that therefore disease arises. So what we're going to do is to have a look at the sources of radioactivity that your clients are likely to be exposed to, the adverse health effects associated with it. We'll briefly look at the legislation in Australia on radioactivity, and most importantly look at how we can address radioactivity and reduce our exposure to it. Okay, it's an interesting thing with regards to radioactivity in terms of its sources within the home. The Aboriginals, for example, have known about or had an inclination that radioactivity was a problem for many years. And I'll just read out a quote I got recently from Geoscience Australia, which is a department within the government on Earth radioactivity. For thousands of years, Aboriginals have recognised a phenomenon called sickness country. This was in parts of Kakadu, and ironically this coincided with very high concentrations of uranium, thorium and radon in the water and air. Now, in this part of Kakadu, the Aboriginals didn't know it was radioactive, but what they did was they observed the animals and the plants in this area and noticed a very strange thing. Firstly, that mammals and certain types of animals would avoid this area like the plague. They didn't hunt there, they didn't sleep there. Only very odd plants tended to grow in this particular area, and as a result of their observation of nature, they were able to conclude that maybe this was an area that was not to be hunted on or to settle on because of its impact on the plants and the animal life. Because we tend to be so disconnected from nature nowadays, we don't see the obvious. And in subjects like geobiology, it's critical to be able to analyse the plants around a home and the geography of the home for us to start to get an idea that maybe something could be wrong. For example, you may be familiar with the fact that along high voltage transmission lines that cacti tend to grow much more prolifically than other types of plants. In fact, they thrive from the ionisation of the corona emanating from these transmission lines. Many other plants do not survive very well near high voltage or extra low frequency fields. Same with radioactivity. So the Aboriginals were already very au fait with this. They didn't call it radioactivity, but they knew that it was sickness country and it wasn't to be gone anywhere near. Radioactive minerals contain unstable atoms that decay over time. Uranium has a half-life of approximately 1,500 years, so it actually takes a long time for it to decay to half its time. And it has many what we call daughter cells, these radioactive isotopes that it breaks down to for many thousands of years. The one that we're most familiar with, in fact I'm sure most of you are familiar with, eventually that uranium breaks down into what we refer to as radon gas. Now, radon gas, when I first started looking into its impact on human health, the US EPA has an enormous amount of information on it. It is actually the second most common cause of lung cancer in the world, second only after smoking. Now that's a pretty amazing statistic.
Yeah, it's huge.
I mean, I knew it was the second most common cause of lung cancer in the US because they have huge amounts of phosphate and granite rock throughout the US, which is radioactive. But the fact that the World Health Organization has acknowledged it as the second leading cause of lung cancer in the world, it accounts for around 19%, I think it is, of all lung cancers worldwide. And it's the second leading cause of lung cancer. So it's something that affects a lot of people in a lot of countries. And up until recently, Australia was thought to be immune to radon and radioactive exposure to its occupants. So we're going to have a look at very briefly have a look at the study that's been done on Australia, what concerns I have as a building biologist about it, and how to determine if your clients are going to be susceptible to radioactivity in their homes. Where are we up here? Rocks and soils. The most well documented of these is radon gas, as I mentioned, and you cannot see or smell it. That's the problem. Like electromagnetic fields, you can't see or smell EMFs or electromagnetic radiation. This is a form of what we refer to as ionising radiation because it splits the DNA. So unlike extra low frequencies and radio frequencies, which you've learnt up to date, this is a form of ionising radiation which is acknowledged to split the atom and therefore increase the risk of cancer. Thus the relationship between nuclear bombs, Chernobyl, etc. and cancer rates. It's found naturally, radon gas is found naturally in low concentrations of about 0.4 picocuries per litre of air around the globe. However, it can seep into buildings from cracks through the foundation where it can then accumulate in the house. Now, the major reason why the US is so susceptible to radon gas exposure is because they tended to build their homes with basements underneath, so the radioactive rocks would be emanating the radioactivity into the basement. Eventually it's changing into radon gas, and because it's got nowhere else to go when it's in the basement, it's seeping up into the house. Now, which types of seasons do you think people are more likely to be exposed to radon?
It's warmer.
Why? Why warmer?
Would it just help the decay? Like, would it...
No, it's not like a VOC that decays, increases with heat.
Contracting? Well, it's not contracting. It's sort of
rising?
Expanding.
Right.
Well, it depends on ventilation, really.
Yeah,
Like, when they're going to be doing more ventilation. And then, in winter when it's really cold, it'll probably go everything shut up.
Oh, yeah.
Yes,
So,
exactly right.
And the heater's on.
It's
That
all
makes
about
sense.
ventilation
Yeah,
with
of
radioactivity. So
Yeah.
in winter and in summer, extreme winter, extreme cold and extreme hot,
heat.
where people use air conditioners or heating systems, they will close the windows and reduce or try and negate passive ventilation in order to keep the house cool or warm. Therefore, that's when the radon gas levels are going to be at their greatest during these seasons. So radon gas, being a gas, is hugely dependent upon the ventilation within a home. However, when people seal their homes, of course, in summer and in winter, that's when their levels are going to peak.
Makes sense.
What areas are most affected?
Yeah, we'll have a look at that.
Oh, okay.
We'll have a look at which areas are most affected. As I said, the US EPA is a great website on radon gas emissions. There's very little in Australia on radon gas. Our PANS are the authority who are responsible for radioactivity, etc. And what's a surprise with our PANSA is the fact that they're not there to legislate to say what radioactivity is acceptable. They will make mention as to what's appropriate and what they suggest, but people who actually enforce it aren't our PANSA. They're not an enforcement agency per se. They just provide recommendations to government agencies as to what's recommended for electromagnetic fields, microwaves, all of those sort of things.
Can you get your house tested for...
You can get
through?
your house tested for radon through our PANSA.
Okay.
Yes, and we'll have a look at that as
Yep,
well.
cool.
Yep. Okay. However, homes can accumulate, especially if they have basements like in the States, they can accumulate radon gas to much higher levels, beyond 4 picocuries per litre, and that's the level in the US at which it's considered to be a high level of radon gas, and therefore that warrants further checking. That's equivalent to around 150 becquerels per metre cubed of air, which is the Australian or standard international units for radioactivity. Our PANSA recommend anything above 200 becquerels per metre cubed needs investigation, and that's too high. But 4 picocuries, which is the US standard, is equivalent to around 150. Homes that are most susceptible are those built on granite or phosphate rock, especially if they have a basement and are poorly ventilated. Radon is the second leading cause of lung cancer worldwide and accounts for over 20,000 deaths in the US alone every single year. So you can imagine you're a non-smoker living in a house somewhere in the States where there's perhaps above a granite deposit and you die of lung cancer when perhaps you've never picked up a cigarette any time in your life. I mean, that's quite devastating. As a result of the fact that it's such a problem in the US, that you will find that radon testing is very common practice with most real estate transactions. What I mean by that is to sell a home, you need to have the radon gas levels checked, and if it's above the acceptable level of about 4 picocuries per litre, you cannot sell it. Which means you'll probably die of lung cancer related death, because unless you can move out of your home, you won't have a lot of options. It's assumed to be less of a concern in Australia as a result of our geology, i.e. that we don't have the vast spans of granitic rock and phosphate rock as the US does. And that many of our homes are built on stumps, which prevents the gas from accumulating in our indoor air, because of course with airflow under the house and stumps, as soon as the radon gas comes in, it dissipates with airflow.
So does it come through a concrete slate?
Yes.
It does.
It's radioactive.
Of course
Radioactivity
it
goes
will,
through everything.
yeah,
You know,
yeah.
nuclear bomb goes through. Radioactivity goes everywhere. So you can just see now the problem arising in Australia with this whole concept of energy efficiency and 6 and 7 star ratings. It's very difficult for a home to achieve a 6 or 7 star rating unless it is built on a concrete slab, amongst other factors. It's very difficult to get that rating if you're building your house on stumps. So the fact that we are moving strongly away from homes built on stumps to concrete slabs is already indicating that radon gas could become more of an issue in this country, because there's no subfloor ventilation, and that can have serious consequences in homes built above known granitic rocks. At the moment, which is an interesting thing, there are no radon gas maps of Australia. I don't know whether it's the cost of them checking radon gas that they don't have any radon maps of Australia. If you look at Europe and you look at the US, there's radon maps all over the US that you can just quickly download from the US EPA, click on to see if you live in an area where radon gas is likely to be an issue. There's no such thing currently in Australia. However, in February of this year they released a radiometric map of Australia. They scanned 80% of Australia. I think they used a plane to do this and check the gamma radiation from 80% of Australia, and then came up with a map called the Radiometric Map of Australia in February of this year to determine levels of radioactivity throughout the whole country. Having recently received that map, you can download it for free on the internet through Geoscience Australia. I think that's ga.org.au. Don't quote me on that, it'll be in your notes. I was heavily surprised at how radioactive Victoria in just about every state is, and I'll show you the map now.
Excellent. Oh my God.
So this is the radiometric map of Australia. I will pass it around. These bits here, the white sections, I'm assuming are those areas of Australia they haven't yet mapped. The white sections are the parts I'm assuming they haven't yet checked. This is the one that's most of interest. You'll see here they are potassium, thorium and uranium. They're the most common radioactive particles found in Australia. Uranium, of course, is the one associated with radon gas. The red areas are the ones with high levels of radioactivity, and you can see Victoria, there's a lot of radioactivity going on in Victoria. Certainly WA, I mean, this is where a lot of the mining happens in Northern Territory. You'd expect high degrees of uranium deposits there, but what is really surprising is the amount that's going on in Victoria, parts of New South Wales, Queensland and the north of Australia is quite high, as is the west part of Australia here. So red are very high levels, and that's certainly the concern insofar as its implications on people who are living in those areas.
How about in Tasmania? Because I can't see from here.
Most of Tasmania hasn't been done.
Ah, that's white, yeah.
That's white. So it hasn't actually been checked.
Yep.
You can see in the north part up
Yeah.
here, that certainly seems to be a bit radioactive with the redness around that area. So uranium, when it breaks down into different types of radioactive isotopes, eventually breaking down into radon gas, people whose homes are built on concrete slabs and in brick are much more susceptible to radon gas emissions, especially if they live in these areas of high radioactivity. Thorium is now being investigated as a potential health concern problems. It's a radioactive isotope, also coming from uranium as a daughter radioactive decay. And you'll see where the red areas are, particularly in WA, that they now suspect that this can lead to serious health conditions as well. So you'll see a lot more about that in probably the years to come, the impact of thorium on people's health. Thank you. So whilst there have been no radon gas investigations thoroughly over the whole of Australia, there has been one study that was conducted by our PANZA in 1991. Let's have a look at that. A random survey conducted in 1991 by our PANZA determined that the average concentration of radon in Australian homes was around 11 becquerels per metre cubed. Now remember, anything above 150 is a concern, so that's quite good. They were random samples of 3,400 homes, which is actually a good sample size. My concern with that is it seems to be a bit of a waste to put the resources in examining homes that just responded to the survey when they now know that homes that are most susceptible to radon gas emissions are those in high radioactive areas, which we've now discovered approximately where that will be around Australia. Secondly, they're built on concrete slabs. Thirdly, they have building materials that are much more likely to be radioactive. So what comes to mind? What sort of building materials do you think are more likely to be radioactive? Granite, absolutely. Yep. What's mined from the ground? Bricks.
Oh, bricks.
Yeah. So if you live in a brick home, especially a brick veneer home, etc., or a solid brick home, then you're much more susceptible to radioactivity coming from those bricks because they're mined from the ground.
And the marble too, or the marble floor,
Yeah.
and things like that, marble bathroom.
Yeah, marble not so likely, but of course being from the ground, it can be radioactive, and it's impossible to determine the degree of radioactivity of any building material without a Geiger counter, which I'll go into in a minute. So in terms of, there are several building materials, but any building material that comes from the ground has the potential to be radioactive because uranium deposits are dispersed throughout the world. They're pretty much ubiquitous throughout the Earth's crust. So we're all exposed to a low level of background radiation. However, that can increase substantially depending on how your home is built, concrete slab, brick veneer. And of course, if you introduce building materials like granite into the home as well, amongst other things that can be radioactive. So it's an interesting thing, having a look at the research of radioactivity in Australia. It's often been dismissed that we don't have a problem. However, looking at a study like this and going, well, they've just sent out all these samples and hoped whoever sent them back then will look at their homes, that's a bit futile. If the house is built on stumps, then it's less likely to be a problem, even if it's in a high radioactive area because of the ventilation under the floor. Ideally, investigations need to be done on homes that are built on concrete slabs, made of brick veneer in high areas known to contain high areas of radioactivity. So these are some things that a building biologist has to consider as part of the investigation of the home. We can no longer think that Australia is safe from radon gas emissions. Based on that study alone, I think that concluded 1 to 3% of the population will be susceptible to radon gas. Well, that's actually, I think, can't be concluded in light of the evidence that has come out recently. In particular, the fact that we now know where the hotspots are within the continent, not least 80% of the continent. Okay, radon, the second leading cause of lung cancer, I've gone into. Another radioactive particle that's receiving increasing attention around the world is thorium. And it's interesting to note that Australia has 19% of the world's thorium levels. It's widely distributed throughout the entire continent of Australia, and we have one of the highest levels of thorium radioactive materials in the world. It's used as an alternative to uranium as a nuclear fuel, and there's a lot of research going on in India and Russia on the use of thorium in reactors, in nuclear reactors in those countries. So it's going to be interesting over the years to see what impact they see thorium as having in terms of radioactivity, And Australia, of course, is one that we're going to have to keep our eye on because we have one of the highest reserves of thorium naturally within the continent itself. So to see if you live in an area of high radioactivity, you can find out by going to the Radiometric Map of Australia, which is available for free through Geoscience Australia, and the website is there, ga.gov.au, and that will give you a perspective on potential sites. Health concerns. The health concerns associated with every type of radioactivity is always going to be its ability to cause cancer. However, there are 3 different types of radioactive isotopes, radioactive frequencies: alpha, beta and gamma. Alpha is considered to be the worst insofar as its impact on human health, but it's only generally a problem if it's inhaled or ingested. Now, alpha particles, the beauty about alpha particles is that they cannot penetrate more than about a centimetre or a millimetre of thickness of anything. So you'll find in your smoke detectors, you have a radioactive isotope called American-241. American-241 is a radioactive isotope that is used in most conventional smoke detectors in our home, and it releases alpha particles when it's within the ionising chamber of the smoke detector, and when smoke passes through, it ionises and then sets off the alarm. So what that means is that, of course, the smoke alarm goes on. No one would question the importance of smoke detectors in a home. What issue I have is the fact that companies can get rid of radioactive nuclear wastes throughout every person's home without disposing of them responsibly. That's the issue I have. Are they a health problem? No. Why? Because they release alpha particles which cannot penetrate beyond the plastic casing of the smoke detector. So it shouldn't be a problem, providing you don't tamper with the smoke detector. Has anyone actually opened up the case and seen that radioactive symbol, nuclear radioactive symbol, in the smoke detector? It says, warning, do not tamper. Don't tamper, because as soon as you start tampering with the ionising chamber, you get exposed to radioactive particles, which of course are extremely dangerous. So as long as you're just taking off the case, replacing the batteries every year as you should, and putting it back on, it should not pose a health risk at all. The issue, that I have is disposing of radioactive wastes through every person's home throughout the Western world potentially, and not disposing of radioactive waste responsibly. That's a big problem. So this is one area in our home where radioactivity is likely to be. You can purchase non-radioactive smoke detectors. They're about $20, $30 from hardware stores. You might need to ask for them, but they're pretty much easy to find in most hardware stores, and something well worth considering if you have an objective to having radioactive smoke detectors in your home. So the health concerns will depend on the particle that's emitted, alpha, beta or gamma. Gamma is the one, of course, associated with all the nuclear blasts, etc. And of course, that's the one that's causing, it ionises the DNA, splits DNA and increases the risk of cancer substantially. In the caption, do you know if your child's braces or strollers are radioactive? Well, that's a pretty harsh statement to put there. I just couldn't help myself.
Funny about that.
Researching radioactive materials in building materials and in our everyday products was an interesting thing, because we don't tend to think of any steel, for example, radioactive steel, as being a problem, or steel being a problem in general. And yet what they're finding now is that as a result of loopholes in legislation in even Western countries, that a lot of metal yards and scrap yards are recycling radioactive metal because they're not checking it first. They're getting it dumped there from other sites, etc., then reselling it, and companies are using it without checking its radioactivity because they probably wouldn't think the steel could be radioactive, and then producing everyday products from this. So that's certainly a problem, and one source. Building materials derived from granite, alum shale and other types of rocks, such as concrete, bricks, natural gypsum, as well as materials derived from industrial byproducts like phosphogypsum, blast furnace slag, red mud from the aluminium production and coal fly ash, are very likely, they are radioactive, but the degree of radioactivity is likely to be higher in these building materials. So concrete, of course, it's made from crushed granite, isn't it? Granite naturally tends to have high levels of uranium. Are more likely to be radioactive. The only way you're going to determine if the building material is radioactive or not is to use a Geiger counter, which is this, and it'll tell us how radioactive the material is. I often say to my naturopathic students, if you're ever going to buy concrete, slate, all of those sort of things, get a building biologist to come with you, shopping, to the tile store, etc., with the Geiger counter to detect how radioactive it is and whether it's acceptable or not. Of course, what you'd always suggest as a building biologist is good passive ventilation in a home. Open the windows, open the doors. If there is a lot of marble or in particularly granite, brick, etc. in the home, then just by opening windows and doors will make a big difference to reducing one's exposure to radioactivity. The problem is nowadays is that our homes, to be energy efficient, they want to seal them as much as possible. Many buildings and high-rise apartments, you can't even open a window. Many workplaces, the majority of workplaces in high-rise buildings in the city, for example, you can't even open a window. So, of course, that becomes an issue as well.
Would it change with time? Like if you go to a new home, will it be higher because it's new?
No.
And will it, the radioactivity will level less probably in 10 years' time?
No, because it takes 1,500 years for the radioactive isotopes from uranium to break down into the next isotope, and then many years before it breaks down into the next. So
yeah, so it doesn't matter when you move it, how old is the house you move in, you still feel it the same.
that's right. Because you think about how long has the Earth been here, and it's had that radioactivity continually decaying over millions of years, and it's still happening. So no, the age of the house will make no difference, unlike VOCs, which are off gases over time and passive ventilation. Radioactivity is radioactivity. It continues to emit those particles. Unless it's from a source like Chernobyl, where it dissipates over time. I mean, it's still going to be radioactive for decades to come. When it comes to building materials and things like that, they're constantly discharging this radioactivity.
What about there's a lot of building products these days that are made from industrial byproducts.
Yes.
I mean, particularly the ones that are promoted as being because they're good because of recycling.
Yes.
But are they really good for these reasons? I mean, isn't there an insulation material that's made of some kind of industrial products?
Oh, I'm sure.
And kitchen bench tops as well. A lot of those are reconstituted from
waste products.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. This whole issue of energy efficient, more importantly, environmentally friendly by recycling old products, particularly products that come from the ground, and steel also, has the potential to be creating more health concerns. Because apart from building biologists, there are very few people that look at the health ramifications of building materials. So yes, this is something that could be an increasing concern. Whilst it's environmentally friendly by recycling a product, its implications, it could be introducing adverse health effects into the home. Definitely. And without a Geiger counter, you're not going to know. In terms of electromagnetic fields, without equipment, you will never know. You can never guess, apart from looking at appliance and going, yes, while it's plugged in, it's going to be emitting electric and a magnetic field. A lot of the EMF issues you find in a home, in a building, are often things you can't see. It's the same with radioactivity, and that's a problem that we can't assume. We can look at the sources, but without meters we'll never know the degree. But that is an interesting one. Recycling of products to be environmentally friendly could be coming at a cost, especially steel. Clocks and watches that glow in the dark contain tritium, which emits very weak levels of radiation that are unable to penetrate beyond the glass, which tells me it's emitting alpha particles, just like our smoke detectors. So that's fine, providing it's not broken. However, they used to use radium as the glow in watches. So in old watches, be very careful that if old watches are broken, etc., it can emit very harmful forms of radiation. Because they were that toxic, they had to ban the use of radium as the glow material in watches for that reason. So my brother-in-law is a watch freak, buys and sells watches. I think the most expensive one he bought was about $40,000 because that's his hobby.
Wow.
And sells them, etc. He has to insure his watches. He's got that many of them, etc. But many of them are very old, from World War I and World War II, and they glow in the dark, and they are radioactive. And so uranium, of course, emits gamma particles as well. radium, so it's going through the actual case. It's not just an alpha particle. That's why they changed from radium to tritium, because tritium releases alpha particles, so it doesn't go beyond the glass case. Radium is gamma as well, so it goes beyond the glass case and exposes the user to radioactive particles, which is a problem. Ceramics and pottery. Zircon is a raw material that contains traces amounts of uranium and thorium and is used in the manufacture of glazes. A lot of ceramics that are glazed and pottery pieces that are glazed could be radioactive. It's interesting, I remember going into a home with a Geiger counter and it started ticking much more quickly as I went towards the kitchen dresser. Tick, 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 and it was actually a vase, a fruit bowl that was glazed with radioactive materials. So you don't want that sort of thing in your home. And that's something very few people think about. Another issue in air pollution, which we may have briefly touched on, glazes, was the issue of lead. Lead glazes were very common as well, used in the colouring of glaze. So as a result of that, that can also be an issue. So pottery is a bit of a thing. If it's glazed, you've got to be careful. It could be radioactive, could contain lead, which means you don't ever store food, and particularly acidic food like fruits and tomatoes and things, in glazed pottery.
And people wouldn't know, would they?
No. Another issue with pottery, just because I'm going off track, is asbestos. The first cases of asbestos happened in potters many hundreds of years ago, because asbestos fibres are naturally found in the ground. So when they're mining the clays, etc., making the pottery, depending on where if they had high levels of asbestos fibres naturally within the ground, then of course they were exposed to that and they end up dying of lung-related diseases as a result of it. An interesting thing. Okay, the next one is gold jewellery. Gold is sometimes used to encapsulate the radium and radon used in the medical treatment of irradiating cancerous tissues. So in chemotherapy, they use radioactive isotopes. Then they use gold to encase it to stop the isotopes from emanating from the material. Some of this has and continues to be recycled on the market as jewellery. I'm not saying all gold jewellery is radioactive, but I'm saying it's impossible to tell without a Geiger counter, unfortunately. So it could be an issue. Homes built on granite or phosphate rock are likely to be exposed to high levels of radon gas, especially if they're built from brick, they're built on a concrete slab, have a basement, or are poorly ventilated. In order to determine if your home is located in high area of radioactivity, we've already gone through that. Look at the radiometric map. But that's an interesting one. That's where I would question how effective the radon study was by our Panzer in 91, which is a long time ago, because it didn't specifically sort out homes that are at high risk. It just provided a random sample of 3,400 homes. A considerable amount of radioactive metal is being recycled into household products and building materials in the US and across the globe. The extent of the problem is completely unknown because scrap yards and recyclers in these countries, and they're not third world countries, they're in Western countries, with nuclear reactors, are not required to screen their metal goods for radiation or report it when it's found. So very few countries have the resources to screen millions of cargo containers for radioactive materials coming onto their shores. So what we can find is that the importation of contaminated products and materials from the USA, from Africa, from India and Asia could be exposing our children to multiple sources of radioactive products. That's why I put the question out, could the stroller be radioactive? Well, it's unlikely, but how do we know if it hasn't been checked for that? And that's certainly an issue that we need to keep at the back of our mind. It's an interesting thing when you look in terms of building biology. You can look at the legislation pertaining to building materials, etc. here, but what you often find is that products that are imported into our country don't tend to follow the same occupational health and safety standards as what's required here. So, for example, a couple of years ago, there was a whole kerfuffle about formaldehyde in children's clothing and in blankets imported from China. In New Zealand, they first detected high levels of formaldehyde, which of course we know is carcinogenic. It's also a very strong skin irritant and lung irritant, found in the blankets and clothes imported from China into New Zealand. Australia and New Zealand then sparked an investigation to see what was going on. Now, of course, things like this are not permitted in manufacturing of products here in this country, but they can be imported from countries that don't have the same health and safety guidelines. It's almost ridiculous because We can't manufacture certain things in this country, but we can import them and get them into the country. And of course, whilst there are government authorities regulating this, the resources required to check every container, as I've indicated, is almost impossible unless you just put tons of money into this to be able to do it. So it's something that we need to be vigilant about as building biologists. That just, again, because it's on the supermarket shelf doesn't mean it's completely safe.
Just to come back quickly, like to the basement before, let's say hypothetically that the whole house is fine, there is no radioactivity, but the basement obviously has radioactivity because it's not ventilated and it's slabs and granite and all that. If the basement is full of radioactivity and you got 2-story house clear of radioactivity, if you sleep on the second floor, you would still feel it, yeah? Because it still comes up.
Absolutely.
Like it goes everywhere, not just into the ground,
That's
like
right.
some, yeah.
And because alpha, in particular gamma particles, go through everything, just like a nuclear bomb.
But how far does it go? Like before it?
Well, it depends on the ventilation on the first floor as to how much will go into the second floor. It's impossible to say. And this is where radon gas checks are so difficult to do, because you can't just get a radon gas test kit, put it in the house for a day and say, I'm exposed to this level. It depends on the weather on the day, the ventilation on that day, whether you had an air conditioning or heating system on. So many things will determine what happens. This is why radon gas test kits need to be in the house for 12 months, ideally. They say a minimum of 3 months, but really it depends on the season that it goes in as to whether it's going to reflect worst case scenario. So in terms of the second floor, if you've got bedrooms in the second floor, if the ventilation is relatively good on the first floor, you might be able to ventilate a lot of that radon gas. But I'd imagine exposed to some degree of radon still. Because the basement is not ventilated, it's going into the first floor, then of course the degree of ventilation will determine how much goes into the second and subsequent floors. In new buildings, really because of this energy efficient push, they're so sealed that of course they continue to not increase, but radon gas will still be an issue in multiple stories. Yeah. So it is a problem. Yeah. And we can't see it. That's the problem. This whole issue of the electromagnetic spectrum, the different types of electromagnetic frequencies and electromagnetic radiation, we're exposed to things that we cannot see. So most people are none the wiser about what they could be exposing themselves to on a daily basis. Okay. Living near or on a nuclear waste dump. You go, okay, we're in Australia. What do you mean nuclear waste dump? We've got Lucas Heights, etc., near Sydney, etc. Could expose your children to harmful forms of radiation. Well, the spate of cancers in Hunters Hill in New South Wales was actually allegedly attributed to the fact that it was a radioactive waste site in the 1970s. Now, Hunters Hill is an interesting one because they also have mobile phone towers, 3 mobile phone base stations in close proximity, and they suspect that could be also contributing to the rate of cancer. Interesting thing about this is that as a building biologist, the most important time to help a client is before they buy a block of land. I can't emphasise enough the importance of research. Going through councils, doing a Google search or Yahoo search to ascertain the history of that site is important, because it was interesting that people who moved into this particular street in Hunters Hill had no awareness of the fact that particularly their particular property was used as a radioactive site, dump site, and after a decade or two the government then allowed it to be sold. So unless you did the research, you would never know that this could be a problem.
Once you find out, like I'm thinking, if you work with builders, and they have a big contract to build, $1 million house on the land, and they take you, and then you find out that it's radioactive and it's not good to build. Would there be a way of clearing that or get rid of that for them to still build? Or
The only way really is to encourage passive ventilation. That is the most effective and most economical way to deal with any form of radioactivity, is to encourage passive ventilation.
because the builders won't like us anymore if we find stuff everywhere they want to build.
Well, exactly. That
gonna
can
be-
be an issue. So you're working more towards the client,
Yeah.
and hopefully educate the client to indicate that the best time to employ your services are before they buy a block of land, and do the research. It'd be always well worth, with hindsight, to have that knowledge and provide advice than to wait retrospectively, build the house and then get you in and have to fix up problems. And again, a lot of, especially multi-storey buildings, are generally built on concrete slabs, of course, for structural integrity, which means that already indicates that if there are any forms of radioactivity naturally within the Earth's crust, that's going to be more of an issue. And the car park, it acts as a basement. So, yeah. It's an interesting thing because Australia was so much, no, we don't have a problem with radon gas, but we've never really checked the entire continent to see if it is a problem. And now with this map indicating high levels of uranium in certain parts of Australia, Victoria is quite a bit. Actually, it's quite surprising. I actually had a patient of mine over 10 years ago who came into the clinic who would have been in his 50s, and I was taking a case history, and he said, when I went to his family history, I asked about his parents' health, and he said, both my parents were non-smokers and they died of lung cancer, which was related to radon gas. He said, do you know anything about it? And they lived in country Victoria. I said, actually, I do know quite a bit about radon gas, and he was the first person to actually say he knew that the doctors had actually concluded that it was due to radon gas that his parents had died from lung cancer.
And that's 10 years ago.
That was over 10 years ago. He came to see me,
Yeah.
and he was in his 50s, 60s, etc., and coming for unrelated diseases. He wasn't in for lung cancer, but he attributed the lung cancer to deaths of his parents to radon gas as a result of living in a certain part of country Victoria. So it's something you cannot assume that's going to be completely safe. It's another thing. So we're developing a checklist as you go through the course in terms of land, using ideal land. You know, you've got geopathic stress you want to check for. Unfortunately, a lot of that can be addressed. Radioactivity, well, we're now getting a better perspective as to where the levels of radioactivity could be higher. The structure of the home itself can lend itself to being more radioactive by introducing radioactive building materials, i.e. bricks particularly. Look, brick is a great material to use. Eventually what it comes back down to is enhancing ventilation, preferably subfloor, having stumps, building on stumps, and in particularly passive ventilation within the home itself. So this real dichotomy between what a healthy home is and what an energy efficient home is. We need to get a balance between the two. We can achieve both, but we need a lot of education out there because no one's addressing the health perspective apart from you guys. So a lot of education is required, and I think it's going to be interesting as our parents, I know they're in the process of doing another study on radon gas in order to determine what implications or how much Australia is affected by this. In particular, thorium is a big concern that they're starting to look into as well. Okay, smoke detectors I've already mentioned. Americum-241 is the radioactive isotope. Waste product from nuclear reactors. As I said, it's not going to be a problem unless you tamper with the smoke detector and fiddle with the ionising chamber. The study from our Panzer showed that homes built directly on the ground had a 30% higher concentration of radon than those built on stumps.
That's massive.
So this is why doing a random study and not looking at the ventilation, does this person open their windows, do they keep the windows shut, do they have an air conditioner or heating system, do they have sealed windows, do they have a concrete, so none of that was looked at in the study of 3,400 homes that they did in 1991. So to me the study is sort of defunct. It doesn't really tell us a lot about what's happening in this country.
But if that was more than 10 years ago, you'd think by now they would have a lot more information or research on it.
No, there've been no.
No,
there've been. I think that's the only study of worth highlighting of radon gas emissions in this country, and it was really a matter of them sending out all their radon gas test kits, and anyone who sent it back after 12 months, then they investigated the findings. But that's really not a useful way to determine radon gas emissions. Up until February, when that map was released, we didn't really know the levels of radioactivity across our continent. Of course, we knew where the mining areas were for uranium, etc., and we just assumed that WA, Northern Territory probably had higher levels of radioactivity because of the geology of those states. However, we now see that it's actually quite different. There are quite radioactive areas within Victoria, particularly South Australia, New South Wales. There are hot spots. So this is an interesting one as building biologists to look into before you even go on site. Could these people be sick as a result of these exposure to radioactivity, which we'd normally associate with nuclear bombs and things like that? Testing for radioactivity of building materials is normally done with a Geiger counter. This is a Geiger counter. It's a Geiger Muller tube named after its founders, Geiger and Muller. I can't remember their first names, the two men. Basically, they're relatively pretty easy to use. However, their units of measurements will vary depending on whether you're in Europe, Australia, the US. They use different standards of units, standardisation units, depending on what country you're in. The thing about radioactivity, of course, is that the major source is likely to be from the ground, so it's really important that you go outside and check the background radiation, because if the house has higher levels, what is that suggesting to you?
Is a house that's higher when it has publicity on a area? Or
It's likely because of the way in which the geology of the area is going to be consistent, I'd imagine, from a short space of being in the house or outside of the house. You're probably on the same rock anyway. So if the radioactivity is high within the home, it's generally going to indicate there are building materials within that home that are creating a higher source of radioactivity, because what's coming from the ground should be consistent in the house outside. So always do your readings outside first to determine the level of radioactivity. That will determine what's coming from the ground. Then come into the house, and if the sources, looking at the known sources of radioactivity, such as brick, ceramic glazes could be radioactive, of course smoke detectors. Smoke detector won't be a problem because it won't go beyond the case, remember? So unless you take the case off and go right towards that ionising chamber, you're not going to pick up much. That's important to determine. So what tends to happen when it comes to determining radioactivity is it can be done in two ways. Using a Geiger counter, checking first the levels outside and getting a general exposure levels of radioactivity per minute and averaging that out after an hour or two, and then determining putting it near a building material and seeing if that level increases. As I said, what you need to do is to determine what's going on outside before you come in inside, because you're not going to get anything lower than what's outside, are you? Because it's coming through the ground, and of course it'll be coming into the house as well. So checking radioactivity materials. That's the main way. Checking the levels outside, and I'm not saying actually getting a unit of measurement per se, because unless you keep it there for days on end, it's difficult to get an accurate reading of the radioactivity in millisieverts per hour or Röntgens, etc. So a more effective way is to determine the counts per minute over a period of an hour or so outside, and then coming inside and doing the same thing. And if it's increased inside, then there's likely to be other sources of radioactivity within the home. So you can see in terms of that counts per minute, it just ticks every time it picks up a radioactive material. So you'll find, and I'll keep that on as we keep going, that'll just keep ticking because it's picking up radioactivity emanating from the ground. So you can, as a result of its ability to data log, etc., ascertain the average, set it on a timer for a particular period of time, get the average, and then compare it to what's going on inside the home.
So is it okay?
It's going up as we speak.
Well, what we need to do first is go outside.
When do we run? At what point?
This is the background radiation you and I are exposed to every day.
Yeah.
We call it terrestrial radiation. This is terrestrial radiation. Terrestrial radiation. And of course we have cosmic radiation from the sky, from the air itself, from exploding stars emitting rays, and we've got terrestrial radiation that comes from within the Earth. This is our natural background radiation that you and I are exposed to every day that we don't see and we don't think about.
So Nicole, if you had that up on a plane while you're flying, you'd expect it to, because gamma rays being
Cosmic,
yes,
yes.
So you'd expect it to
Increase
up
Yeah.
there. Yeah. Okay. So
because the metal of the plane isn't going to stop radioactivity.
Stop it, exactly. Yeah.
No.
Yeah. Wow.
And this was an issue, of course, when the astronauts went up into space. When they went through the ionosphere, they had these amazing millions of pinhole holes throughout the helmets, etc., in their suits, because they were exposed to cosmic radiation, which is again another form of radioactivity, which of course increases the risk of cancer substantially, etc. This whole thing about the ozone, of course, you get more UVB rays and other forms of radiation coming through.
Seems to be ticking more closer to you.
It's her, isn't it?
Alright, so I'll just pass it on to you guys to see that.
So if you put it near jewellery, like you're saying before, gold jewellery,
Yes.
sometimes it would like increase. Yeah.
Yeah, you'd have to first get an
Depending,
average
of
because you
course.
can see
Yeah.
sometimes it ticks more than others as
Yeah.
it picks up radioactive particles that are probably emanating from the ground here.
Mm.
The fact that we have a car park underneath, and this is what you'd have to do in research as part of being a building biologist. If you're doing this site, you would go outside first to check the background levels of radioactivity, probably leave it for an hour, then put the timer on, then come inside. You'd look at the fact that it's a concrete car park underneath, but it's well ventilated. There's a completely open side, so any form of radon gas is likely to escape. Radioactive isotopes will continue to come up. Okay, so when it comes to ventilation, I'm not referring to radioactive particles, I'm referring to radon gas. It's the gas that needs to be ventilated. Radioactive, as you can see here, we're at the college, there's an open car park underneath us that's well
Thank God.
ventilated. So if radon gas was accumulating in the car park, it would be ventilated out, so we wouldn't be picking that up. And this is not a machine to pick up radon gas. This is picking radioactivity. So radioactivity comes up through concrete, goes through everything pretty much, and that's what it's picking up now. Radon gas, you use a completely different test kit to pick that up. It's like a tube with a sticky, I don't even know what that sticky bit is. You open up the container, put it on the roof and leave it there for months on end, potentially 12 months. And then you seal it up, take it to the lab, and they ascertain the levels of radon gas within your home.
So what's the number again where you should be worried about?
Well, it's not so much the number that's the issue here in terms of counts per minute. It's just saying that the average counts per minute should be the same as outside, not higher. Because if it's high, it's indicating there's something within the home that's increasing it, such as brick veneer or solid brick homes.
Yeah, but if it's like, let's say, average 35 here,
Yes,
but you go somewhere else, it's average 50 or somewhere else 100. It would be
200.
worse, no?
Remember, 150 becquerels per metre cubed was the readings that are acceptable, that maximum level allowed in the States, or 0.4 or 4 picocuries per litre.
Yeah, but does it mean it's, because what they say, the government's not always mean it's healthy for us.
Yes,
If you look like the mega goes for electric magnetic field,
yes,
there's a huge difference between what they say is allowed and what's actually
yes, absolutely.
So
In
is
terms
it
Well, the background radiation levels around the world is about 0.4. You can't get below that. In terms of building biology standards, I'm actually not sure we have one. I'd have to check that up and make sure to have a look in terms of that. So 0.4 picocuries per litre is the background radiation you and I are exposed to, and there's no way you can get below that because that's just naturally
0.4?
0.4. Yeah.
That seems very low.
Yeah,
When you
which is
do-
about, let me see, about 15 becquerels per metre cubed, which is the Australian way of looking at the standard international units that we're exposed to, about 15 becquerels per metre cubed.
So
of air.
far they say up to 200.
Up to 200 before they need to do something about it. The states would say 150. Yeah, in Panza would say 200. Anything above 200 becquerels per metre cubed is something you need to look into. Yeah. So knowing what you know, walking into a home built on a concrete slab, built of solid brick or brick veneer, poor ventilation, and likely to be built in an area of high radioactivity, then you need to start thinking about, could this house be affected by radon gas or radioactivity in general? Because of course we haven't gone into thorium. There's not enough research or information on the impact of thorium or even how to test it. I'm not clear about how they would test for thorium radioactivity. I mean, the radioactivity in general is determined by a Geiger counter, which is what this is. So this is picking up radioactive particles. It doesn't pick up radon gas because it's a gas. You need something different to pick up radon gas. Radon gas forms as a result of the decay of uranium isotopes over many years, thousands of years. And eventually when radon is inhaled in the lungs, it forms lead atoms. And it's the lead atoms that actually cause the cancer. So, as you can see, you'd have to average this over a long period of time because it's gone from 38 to 52 counts per minute. It's jumping. And then you'd want to average it over a period of time, then come into the house and do the same thing. So you'd conduct an audit and leave this somewhere and then come back to it. Now, up until this time, building biologists in Australia didn't really look at this as an issue because we've always assumed it's not going to be a problem. But in light of what we're now discovering in terms of the amount of radioactive areas throughout Australia, and the fact that we're moving towards concrete slab energy efficient homes, I think we need to be more vigilant about the fact that this could be an issue in a minority of people that you're going to see.
Just an interesting, last year, the consult, the geo consult I did in Tasmania, and they bought a block of land, and the lady was really badly suffering from chronic fatigue, and it was, the land was on such a slope, like a really, really huge slope, and it was like country Tasmania, but they had a beautiful view of the ocean, etc. When I was dowsing, I picked up a watercourse that was radioactive. And it was really interesting. It was all on granite where they were building, but because they were on a slope, they were thinking about having it like stumped. So that's a good thing because there'll be ventilation under there before they build. But she's so sick as it is. I'm just thinking.
I think she had chronic fatigue before she even moved.
Exactly. That's why she moved from here to Tasmania initially. You know who I'm talking about, yeah. So
she's not near a farming community or timber plantation.
There's hardly anything there. It's like it's literally on this slope I'm talking about, 45-degree angle slope, and beautiful views of the ocean, etc. But you can imagine the water running like down this hill. But where she was actually building, the block of land was already bought, full of granite, and that's why I was picking up with the rods, radioactive.
Yeah.
And water courses.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And so with that, doesn't matter where you hold it. You have to direct it. Comes from everywhere.
The chamber. Yep, that's picking up the radioactive.
So if you put it like that,
Generally, that's how you would hold it when you're checking for building materials.
What did you
That's
do?
right. Yep.
So
They're
what is
quite
the
easy to
solution?
use.
Just
How much are they?
Gosh, I bought that so long ago. You would hire it because it wouldn't be many cases that you would get it, that you would use a guided counter. I think I paid about $1,000 for it. Yeah, but it's not something that I've hardly ever used, and I can't see building biologists justifying the cost of getting something like that. They would hire it. I'm sure our plans are probably higher, guided counters. But this is where you need to look at, and you'd ask questions in your questionnaire to the client. You know, what is your house made of? Just so you start to get a feel for what are the type of hazards that could exist in their home. Okay, testing for radon in the home. Radon test kits are available to detect radon levels within the home. In Australia, they can be purchased from the PANZA, that's the Australian Radiation Protection and Nuclear Safety Agency. A simple search on the internet will provide the details of supplies in the US and abroad. It's actually quite cheap. Radon gas checks, $20 or something like that. It's not very expensive at all. Be mindful, however, that random checks only provide a crude indication of the actual radon concentrations because they can fluctuate enormously depending on the weather on the day you used it, the structure of the building, brick versus timber, the ventilation rate on the day of the home. And as I said, doing it for one day is really a waste of time. You really need to keep it in for 3 months minimum, preferably up to 12 months, to get an actual reading of what's going on. And in the States they do. So they have a good perspective on which homes are most susceptible and which parts of the US are to radon gas. Realistically, estimating the annual average concentration of radon in an indoor air requires reliable measurements for at least 3 months, many would say 12 months. If the levels are above 4 picocuries per litre or 150 becquerels per metre cubed, you should contact your local radiation health authority in your state or territory. Solutions, elevated radon levels in a home. So I've talked about radon. Radioactivity, of course, is another issue insofar as it's not radioactive, is particles and gases. That's not a gas like radon. So a Geiger counter is used to pick up radioactive particles. Radon gas, you need a different test kit once again. So if you have elevated levels of radon in your home, there are several things that you can employ, but the most economical of those is to open windows, enhance passive ventilation. Because it's a gas, it's ventilated that way. Of course, if it's thorium radioactive isotope, then increasing ventilation isn't going to do anything because it's coming up through everything. The most cost-effective ways to enhance passive ventilation by opening windows and doors. You'd be amazed how many people don't do this, don't air their homes on a daily basis, either because of theft or because they can't, because it's sealed and it's in an energy-efficient home, tongue-in-cheek. It is a problem. To prevent it coming into the home, a barrier or membrane between the home and the ground can be used to seal the gas. But of course, this is assuming you have
Access.
crawl space underneath. And if you have a crawl space underneath, it's less likely to be an issue in the first place. More comprehensive forms of remediation, such as active soil depressurisation, can be employed. I don't know anyone in Australia who does it. I haven't looked actively, I have to admit, but I don't know anyone here. In the US, of course, there are heaps of companies that do this sort of thing. But of course requires expert advice. For detailed discussion on addressing radon in your home, refer to the US EPA's website. Excellent website for air contaminants, water contaminants, fantastic for radioactivity. They're very active. If I look at the EPA here in this country, it's pitiful compared to what's available in the US. It's a real shame. Whether we just don't have the resources, I'm not sure, or whether we just are none the wiser as to, air and water contaminants, I don't know, but US EPA website's excellent. Okay, other sources of ionising radiation. I've primarily focused on what's going on in terms of within our home, and that's what you need to know mainly as building biologists. However, people can be exposed to radioactive isotopes just by having cancer treatment, chemotherapy. So there are medical sources of radiation. A barium meal. Often people take a barium meal radioactive solution to determine clogged arteries and other things like that. Industrial uses. There are labs that use radioactive materials for industrial scientific purposes. Hopefully they get rid of those wastes responsibly, as they should, and they're required to in terms of legislation. Of course, the fallout from nuclear weapons testing and accidents around the world. There are radioactive particles throughout the entire world because of nuclear tests and because of the nuclear bombs that have gone off around the world. It affects all of us. So this is, in fact, I think it was Sweden or Finland that first detected that a radioactivity was a problem after Chernobyl, because the Russians didn't admit it instantly. Finland or Sweden, I think were the first countries, because of their guide counters, started to go off and realised that this radioactive cloud was sweeping through Europe before the Russians admitted that they'd had an accident. So it affects all of us everywhere. In terms of legislation, we have what's called the Radiation Act 2005, which was enacted. An act, of course, means that it's legally enforceable. Enacted by our Panzer to protect the health and safety of people and protect the environment from harmful forms of radiation. It does not appear to be happening in light of the numerous cases of electrical sensitivity that are not occurring. Blah, blah, blah. That doesn't make sense, doesn't it? Regulations. Radiation Regulations 2007 and Codes of Practices. Most of the legislation pertaining to radioactivity really relate to scientific labs and people using radioactive waste as part of research. There is very little related to exposure to issues within a home, because we thought that there was never going to be a problem. And I'm really saying, as a building biologist, it's something that you need to look into. So download the map through Geoscience Australia. I think it's $9.90 to buy the poster, plus postage. And that'll start giving you a good perspective as to what problematic areas there are within Australia if you're going there, to do consults there, and in particular if they have a home that increases the susceptibility to exposure. Measuring radiation levels, we'll go into that in more detail in occupational health and safety and what different countries see as their units of activity, equivalent dose, effective dose, absorbed dose. I won't bore you with the details at the moment. Classification of radioactivity, radiation sickness, etc. Really, we'll go into that when we do occupational health and safety. So in terms of risk control, the most important thing you can do is for radon gas, of course, is to ventilate, to really think about the type of building materials you bring into the home. And if you do like a lot of natural materials, which is nice, rock is fantastic, etc., but make sure it's just not radioactive. Another thing to worry about. An important thing I really want to focus on is the fact that not all radiation is bad. We have what's called terrestrial radiation, which is what I've referred to as the background radiation. We are all exposed to a low level of radiation as a result of the geology and the fact that uranium, thorium and other radioactive isotopes exist naturally within the Earth. We don't want to prevent this from occurring, and in fact we can't really. An interesting study in terms of rats in Faraday cages, i.e. in metal cages, they found that over a period of several generations, I think it was about 3 or 4 generations, that these rats eventually became infertile when they were living in a metal box per se, where they were not exposed to natural background radiation, or what we refer to as terrestrial radiation. So as a building biologist, it does concern me that we are building more and more homes on concrete slabs, metal, in metal steel framed homes, and therefore potentially affecting the terrestrial radiation, the natural radiation that we've evolved on, suddenly becoming something that we're not exposed to. And this could have implications later on down the track in terms of our health, potentially in terms of our fertility, if we were to look at the animal studies on this. And something that we need to be more mindful of. So not all radiation is a bad thing. You can't get away from it. It's a natural part of our evolution. However, there are some areas that are much more radioactive than others, and that is a concern. And there are homes, by bringing in radioactive materials, of course, we expose ourselves to higher levels, which of course could be harmful.